The Nevada desert in 1966 was a place of absolutes. Under the relentless, noonday sun, the vast expanse of the Carson Sink didn't just get hot, it became a kiln, baking the hard-packed earth and salt flats into a cracked white plain that shimmered like a phantom sea. The air itself wavered, distorting the distant purplish humps of mountains, turning the landscape into a mirage. It was a perfect, pitiless laboratory for machines of war. Against this surreal, burning backdrop, a small convoy of vehicles sat idling, their diesel engines clattering in the stillness. Among them stood the new mainstay of American armored might, the M60 Patton, a 50-ton behemoth of cast steel and menace, its long 105mm gun pointing like an accusing finger at the horizon. It looked exactly like what a tank should be, substantial, imposing, a fortress on tracks. And then there was the other vehicle. It crawled forward from a dust cloud of its own making, and the contrast was almost comical. Parked next to the Patton, it looked less like a weapon of war and more like a scaled-down prototype, a toy that had wandered onto the wrong set. It was short, barely over 8 feet tall to the turret roof, and squat with a low, angular silhouette that hugged the ground. Its tracks were wide, but the vehicle itself seemed impossibly light, almost tentative in its movements. This was the XM551, soon to be designated the M551 Sheridan. It wasn't just a new tank, it was a walking contradiction, a bundle of compromises forged in the feverish climate of the Cold War. Part tank, part paratrooper vehicle, part audacious high-stakes experiment. And, depending on which sweating, dust-caked observer you asked on that Nevada range, it was already shaping up to be part disaster. The Sheridan was born from a dilemma that had haunted Pentagon strategists since the late 1950s. The Soviet Union was not just building tanks, it was building armies of them. The T-54 and T-55 and the looming specter of the next-generation T-62 were rolling off production lines by the thousands. They were rugged, simple, and formidable. NATO's answer hinged on quality and heavy firepower, but there was a terrifying scenario known as the Fulda Gap, a corridor in West Germany, through which Soviet armor was expected to pour in a blitzkrieg that would overwhelm Europe before reinforcements could cross the Atlantic. In this scenario, speed of deployment was everything. The existing M41 Walker Bulldog, a light tank, was undergunned and obsolete. The U.S. needed something new, something that could be flown across the ocean in strategic airlifters or even dropped from the sky with paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne, and yet still pack enough punch to knock out a Soviet main battle tank. It was, on paper, an impossible ask. The holy trinity of armor design is firepower, protection, and mobility. You can only ever pick two. The Army, driven by the urgent doctrines of air-land battle and rapid deployment, demanded all three. The engineers at the Allison division of General Motors, who won the contract, were told to perform a miracle. The mandate was clear: a vehicle weighing under 16 tons, so it could be airdropped or carried by the new C-141 and C-330 Hercules transports, armed with a weapon capable of defeating any known Soviet armor, and with enough cross-country mobility to keep up with and support airborne infantry. It was, on paper, a cocktail of cutting-edge and catastrophic risk. To save weight, they abandoned traditional rolled steel. The hull of the Sheridan was made of welded aluminum alloy, a technique borrowed from the nascent M113 armored personnel carrier. It was a revolutionary choice, shaving off tons, but it traded the brittle hardness of steel for a softer metal that was excellent at absorbing shock, but deeply suspect when it came to resisting penetrations. This wasn't armor, it was a weight-saving shell. The turret, however, was conventional steel, creating a strange hybrid, a light body topped with a heavier head. And then there was the gun. This was the Sheridan's party piece, its reason for being. It was not merely a cannon, it was the massive M81 152mm gun launcher, a complex, rifled barrel that served a dual purpose. It could fire conventional rounds, high-explosive anti-tank shells, canister shot, and a potent high-explosive round. But its true genius, and its true curse, was its ability to fire the MGM-51 Shillelagh anti-tank missile. This was science fiction made real, a guided missile about the size of a man's leg that a gunner could steer directly onto a target up to 2 kilometers away by keeping his crosshairs centered. The theory was beautiful. A Sheridan could pop from behind cover, fire a missile with a first hit probability nearing 90%, and slam a shape-charged warhead through the frontal armor of any tank in the world, all without ever exposing itself to return fire. It promised to make the lightweight vehicle a giant killer. But the reality on that Nevada range was a symphony of distressing noises and unsettling outcomes. The recoil from the massive 152mm, especially when firing a conventional shell, was vicious. The tank, so light on its feet, lacked the mass to absorb the kick. When the gun fired, the entire vehicle would rock violently backward, the suspension groaning. On early tests, the shockwaves traveled through the lightweight hull and turret with such force that optics would crack, wiring would snap, and sensitive fire control components would shake loose. It wasn't just firing a gun, it was subjecting the machine, and the men inside it, to a localized earthquake with every shot. And then there was the signature Sheridan smoke. When the conventional cannon fired, the breech would open automatically to eject the spent casing, but it also vented a tremendous, billowing cloud of white smoke and unburned powder grains directly into the turret, choking the crew and blinding them for critical seconds. Externally, the muzzle blast was catastrophic for stealth. It kicked up a towering, mushrooming geyser of dust and debris that could be seen from miles, perfectly pinpointing the vehicle's location. In the electronic warfare future everyone envisioned, and in the close ambush country of Vietnam that was becoming a present reality, it was like firing a flare gun every time you pulled the trigger. The final chilling flaw was the armor. During live-fire tests, crews watched in horror as 50 caliber Browning machine gun rounds, a staple of enemy anti-aircraft and heavy weaponry, not only pierced the aluminum hull, but kept going, ricocheting around the interior in a deadly storm of spall. This wasn't about surviving a hit from a Soviet 115mm smoothbore. This was about potentially being gutted by weaponry that every infantry company on the battlefield possessed. The aluminum, while good against shell fragments, was terrifyingly vulnerable to direct, kinetic energy. A rumor began to circulate among the tight-knit armor community, attributed to a furious general after a particularly dismal demonstration. This isn't a tank, it's a coffin with a missile launcher. The program teetered on the brink of cancellation. Traditional tankers, men who believed in the sanctity of armor plate and the thunder of a direct-fired cannon, viewed the Sheridan as a heresy, a fragile, overcomplicated death trap dreamed up by accountants and aviation generals. But history, in the form of a distant, escalating war, was about to intervene. The Sheridan, for all its glaring faults, had one thing the Army suddenly desperately needed. It existed. By 1968, the dilemma in the Pentagon's corridors was palpable. The Sheridan was a problem child, but the war in Southeast Asia had become a screaming, immediate crisis. The neat theoretical battles of the European plains had been replaced by the suffocating, triple-canopy jungles of Vietnam, a terrain that devoured heavy equipment. The mighty M48 Pattons sent there were formidable, but they were also 50-ton albatrosses. They bogged down in rice paddies, collapsed narrow jungle bridges, and their massive fuel appetites strained fragile supply lines. What field commanders were begging for was something else entirely, a mobile direct fire support vehicle. Something that could keep up with infantry through thick jungle trails, cross the lighter bridges of the Mekong Delta, and bring a substantial gun to bear on enemy bunkers, troop concentrations, and the occasional captured or supplied North Vietnamese PT-76 tank.
The Sheridan, paradoxically, fit this bill in ways its designers never fully intended. Its flaws in a European context became curious advantages in Vietnam. The violent recoil? In a war where engagements were often at point-blank range, the first shot was usually the last shot that mattered. The billowing dust cloud? In the perpetual humidity and dense foliage of Vietnam, dust was less of an issue, and the cloud was often swallowed by the jungle itself. The aluminum armor? It was still thin, but the primary threats in Vietnam were not high-velocity tank shells. They were rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, recoilless rifles, and mines. The aluminum hull, it was discovered, had one saving grace. When hit by a shaped charged warhead, it tended to melt and burn rather than shatter into deadly fragments. It was a horrific trade-off. Crews now faced the risk of burning to death in a chemical fire, but it was arguably preferable to being shredded by steel spall. The vehicle's lightness meant it could go where the Pattons could not, and its low silhouette made it a harder target to spot and hit. Most importantly, that complicated 152mm gun launcher, found its purpose not in firing guided missiles. The Shillelagh system was temperamental, expensive, and utterly unnecessary against the targets in Vietnam, but in firing a devastating array of conventional rounds. The high explosive shell was a bunker buster. The canister round, essentially a giant shotgun shell filled with thousands of flechettes, was a weapon of terrifying brutality for clearing jungle trails of ambushing infantry. And then there was the beehive round, a canister round packed with not just flechettes, but several hundred small fin-stabilized darts. Fired into a tree line, it produced a sound like a monstrous rending tear, followed by an eerie whistling scream as the darts scythed through the vegetation. It was one of the most feared weapons of the war. So, with deep reservations and under a storm of protest from armor purists, the U.S. Army made a fateful decision. The M551 Sheridan would be rushed into production and deployed to Vietnam. It was a decision born of desperate necessity, a gamble that the unique environment of that war would mitigate the vehicle's catastrophic design flaws. Crews, many of them young draftees with minimal training on the complex system, were told they were getting a new, state-of-the-art armored reconnaissance airborne assault vehicle. Veterans of heavier tanks took one look at its thin skin and nicknamed it with gallows humor the aluminum cloud or the thin skin. The deployment was reluctant, nervous, and under protest from those who believed they were sending men to war in a fundamentally flawed machine. In early 1969, the first Sheridans arrived in Vietnam, issued primarily to the 1st and 4th Squadrons of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, and later to the 3rd Squadron of the 4th Cavalry and units of the 25th Infantry Division. They were met with a mixture of curiosity and deep skepticism. The crews, climbing into the cramped, hot interior for the first time, noted how the aluminum walls felt disturbingly warm to the touch even before the sun hit them. They learned the intricate 17-step drill to fire a conventional round, a process fraught with potential for misfire or that suffocating backblast of smoke. They discovered the electrical system was temperamental, and the missile system, still installed but almost never used, was a labyrinth of delicate, dust-prone electronics. But then they took it into the field, and something unexpected began to happen. The Sheridan, for all its sins, worked. Its mobility was a revelation. It could traverse soggy ground that would sink a Patton, push through dense brush, and ford rivers with relative ease thanks to a built-in flotation screen that could be erected, a feature from its airborne origins. Its low profile allowed it to use the jungle for cover more effectively, and that massive 152mm gun, when it worked, delivered a staggering amount of firepower exactly where the infantry needed it. A column of Sheridans could provide a moving wall of suppression and destruction for advancing troops. In the assault on enemy base areas or the defense of fire support bases like Coral and Balmoral during the 1968 offensives, the Sheridan's gun became a prized asset for commanders. The crews developed a fierce, if deeply conditional loyalty to their fragile mounts. They learned tricks, carrying extra crew-served weapons like M60 machine guns welded to the turret for extra firepower, stacking sandbags on the whole floor to try and mitigate mine blasts, a futile but psychologically comforting measure, and developing a quick choreographed dance to evacuate the turret after firing a conventional round before the smoke cloud choked them. They respected the vehicle not for what it was supposed to be, a Soviet tank killer, but for what it had become, a versatile, potent, and uniquely vulnerable supporter of the grunt on the ground. It was not a tank in the traditional sense. It was a gun truck that had graduated to the big leagues, a glass cannon that could throw a punch far heavier than its weight class suggested. The war in Vietnam did not prove the Sheridan was a good tank. It proved the Sheridan was a useful weapon system in a very specific, brutal kind of war. It left a deep psychological scar on the armor's armor branch. The vehicle had been forced into service not because it was ready, but because there was no alternative. It had saved the program from cancellation, but in doing so, it had cemented a reputation for dangerous compromise. When the last Sheridans were withdrawn from Vietnam in 1972, they returned not as heralded heroes, but as controversial survivors. They had passed their trial by fire, but the fundamental questions about their design, their reliability, and their place on a modern battlefield remained unanswered and were now about to be tested in a completely different kind of hell. The atmosphere in the Mission Control Center at Vandenberg Air Force Base on that crisp, clear morning in the fall of 1963 was a fragile alloy of confidence and coiled tension. The air smelled of ozone, stale coffee, and the peculiar warm dust scent of overworked vacuum tubes. Rows of men in white short-sleeve shirts and dark ties sat before monolithic consoles. their faces illuminated by the green phosphorescent glow of radar scopes and status boards. At the front of the room, a large wood veneer plot table, its surface a map of the northeastern Pacific, awaited the story its glowing tracks would tell. This was the nerve center for the Program 505 test, the second live-fire trial of the LIM-49 Nike Zeus anti-ballistic missile system. The stakes could not have been higher, nor the political eyes upon them more watchful. The Zeus was America's trembling spear held against the sky, a desperate answer to the existential terror of the nuclear ICM. Since Sputnik's beeping orbit in 1957, the nightmare scenario had crystallized. A rain of Soviet R-7 Semyorka missiles, each carrying a multi-megaton warhead, arcing over the North Pole with no warning, and, crucially, with no defense. Civil defense drills taught children to hide under desks, but the Pentagon's answer was to build a shield. The Zeus was that shield, or at least its most promising prototype. It was a beast of a missile, nearly 50 feet tall, weighing over 22,000 pounds, with 3 solid-fuel rocket stages designed to hurl a nuclear-tipped interceptor out of the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds. Its mission was not merely to hit an incoming warhead, it was to perform a feat of celestial sniper work, detonating a low-yield nuclear warhead of its own in the lethal emptiness of space, close enough to vaporize or disable the Soviet re-entry vehicle in a flash of X-rays. It was an insane task of complexity, requiring radar systems that could track both target and interceptor, and a guidance computer that could calculate an intercept solution in the blink of an eye. The entire concept was borderline science fiction, but in the Cold War, science fiction had a budget and a deadline.
But that first test had been, in the sterile language of engineering, highly scripted. The target's trajectory was known perfectly in advance. The atmospheric conditions were ideal. The Zeus team had months to prepare. This second test, designated Zeus 505, was different. It was designed to be more dynamic, more stressful, closer to a real combat scenario. The target missile, another Jupiter, would fly a different profile. The Zeus would have to react to less perfect data. The margin for error, already measured in a handful of meters when dealing with objects moving at over 15,000 miles per hour, was infinitesimally small. The confidence from the first test was real, but it was layered over a deep, unspoken anxiety. Every man in the room knew they were probing the absolute edge of what was technologically possible. The countdown was a metallic, deliberate chant over the squawk box. T-minus 30 seconds. Mark. Fingers hovered over keys. Engineers leaned into their scopes, their shoulders tense. On Kwajalein, 4,800 miles away, the Zeus interceptor stood in its semi-hardened launch cell, a needle of polished white pointed at the endless blue. Launch. Zeus is away. A shudder ran through the building as the live feed from the atoll showed a geyser of flame and a spear of white climbing impossibly fast on a pillar of its own making. The data began to flood in. First stage separation was nominal. The second stage ignited, a second, smaller sun pushing the missile faster, higher. The third stage, the crucial kick that would propel the kill vehicle into the exo-atmospheric engagement zone, fired perfectly. On the plot table, 2 bright green lines, one for the target warhead, one for the Zeus, raced across the map, their predicted courses drawn in faint glowing yellow. They began to curve towards each other, a deadly high-speed rendezvous being orchestrated by banks of IBM mainframes chewing through miles of punch card data. In the control room, a low murmur of confusion swelled into a chorus of sharp technical calls. Flight, guidance. We have lost steering input. Repeat, no steering commands. Flight, telemetry. I'm seeing a freeze on the onboard processor. No data stream from the guidance package. The Zeus's brain had simply stopped. Its inertial guidance system, now operating in a vacuum, was holding a last known course, but its active homing system, the sophisticated radar and computer that was supposed to make the final hair-split adjustments to achieve a hit, was silent. The interceptor was now a blind, deaf, multi-ton artillery shell fired into space on the wrong trajectory. The 2 lines on the plot table, which should have merged into a single triumphant flash, continued on their lonely paths. They diverged. The gap between them, measured in the control room in miles, was a chasm of failure. The target warhead, a dummy, continued its parabolic arc and plunged harmlessly into a pre-designated sector of the ocean. The Zeus, its fuel spent, followed its own doomed ballistic path. It re-entered the atmosphere over 1,000 miles from the target zone, breaking apart in a shower of molten debris that sparkled briefly against the blackness, before vanishing into the vast, indifferent waters of the Pacific. The miss distance was later calculated, over 900 kilometers. It wasn't a miss, it was an irrelevance. The silence that fell in the Mission Control Center was profound, broken only by the steady, maddening beep of a carrier wave from a dead missile. Men removed their headsets slowly. Some put their heads in their hands. Others just stared at the plot table, where the two green tracks now stood as a perfect diagram of catastrophic failure. The mission clock ticked on, a pointless metronome. The senior controller finally keyed his mic, his voice flat and drained of all emotion. "All stations, this is flight. We are terminating the test. We have a no-intercept condition. I repeat, no intercept." In the aftermath, the blame game began with the cold efficiency of a post-mortem. The telemetry data was pored over by teams working in shifts under the harsh fluorescent lights of the analysis lab. The initial reports pointed to a software glitch. A subroutine in the guidance computer's target tracking algorithm had encountered an unanticipated condition, a specific combination of radar return signals and kinematic data, and had entered a closed loop, a state of computational catatonia. It wasn't a crash, it had simply stopped calculating altogether. The program managers from the prime contractor, McDonnell Douglas, argued it was an anomaly, a freak occurrence born of the immense complexity of the code, which stretched to hundreds of thousands of lines. They pointed to the pristine success of the first test. The hardware performed flawlessly, one engineer insisted in a tense briefing. The missile flew perfectly. We have a software integration issue, a bug. We can patch it. But the military officers overseeing the program, men whose careers were now tied to this billion-dollar gamble, saw a deeper, more systemic rot. They blamed the rushed deadlines, the relentless pressure from Washington to show results. The missile gap fear was at its peak. Congress was pouring money into defense, but demanded visible progress. The Zeus program had been accelerated, its testing schedule compressed. "You're trying to run before you can walk," a colonel from the Army's Air Defense Command growled during a closed-door meeting. That wasn't a missile failure. That was a management failure. We forced a system into a test it wasn't ready for. But the truth, as it began to seep from the painstaking forensic analysis conducted by a small, independent engineering review board at Bell Labs, was far worse than a glitch or a rushed schedule. It was a fundamental, philosophical flaw in the very heart of the system. It was a truth so inconvenient, so devastating to the entire premise of the Zeus program, that it was initially met with disbelief, then with resistance, and finally with a cold, dawning horror. The independent review team worked not in the charged atmosphere of Vandenberg or the corporate halls of McDonald, but in the quiet, scholarly environments of Bell Labs in Murray Hill, New Jersey. They were mathematicians and physicists, specialists in signal processing and orbital mechanics, men insulated from the program's politics and personal stakes. Their mandate was simple: take the raw data from both the successful first test and the catastrophic second, and explain the discrepancy. They approached it not as a troubleshooting exercise, but as a fundamental inquiry into the laws of physics as they applied to the Zeus system. For weeks, they lived in a world of equations, telemetry printouts, and radar film. They modeled the engagement scenarios down to the millisecond. They simulated the performance of the Zeus phased array radar, the ZAR, which was tasked with tracking both the target and the interceptor amidst a storm of natural and man-made noise, cosmic radiation, atmospheric distortion, and the deliberate electronic clutter a savvy enemy would deploy. And it was here, deep in the arcane world of radar cross-sections and Doppler shift filtering, that they found the ghost in the machine. The Zeus's tracking and discrimination algorithm, the software's core logic for picking out the actual Soviet warhead from a cloud of decoys, tumbling booster debris, and chaff, was not merely buggy, it was brittle. It was exquisitely, dangerously optimized. The Bell engineers discovered that the algorithm's ability to successfully identify and lock onto the target warhead was not a robust, general capability. It functioned reliably only under one extremely narrow and idealized set of conditions. These conditions were a specific confluence of factors: the target's altitude, its velocity vector relative to the interceptor, its radar signature against the background of space, and even the levels of solar flare activity affecting upper atmospheric ionization. The algorithm had been tuned, essentially, to pass a very specific exam. And the first test, the glorious program-saving success, had, by sheer blind cosmic luck, presented that exact set of conditions. The Jupiter target's flight path, its spin, the time of day, the ambient space weather, all of it had fallen within the algorithm's tiny, happy window of operation. Nature had accidentally cooperated. The system had worked not because of its brilliant, adaptable design, but because the universe had, for one brief moment, lined up perfectly with its prejudices. It was the equivalent of a safecracker who only knows one combination happening upon a safe already set to those numbers. The second test, with its slightly different engagement geometry, had fallen outside that window. The target's radar return had presented a different Doppler profile. The background noise from the Pacific auroral zone was marginally higher. The algorithm, confronted with this new real-world data, did not adapt. It did not gracefully degrade. It searched its limited library of solutions, found none that matched its rigid criteria, and, as the Bell report would starkly phrase it, entered a null state of indecision. The computer hadn't crashed. It had been paralyzed by ambiguity. It was a system designed for a laboratory-perfect engagement, incapable of handling the chaotic, unpredictable realities of combat.
The implications were soul-crushing. It meant the Nike Zeus, in its current form, was a theater piece, a fair-weather weapon. It could potentially defend the United States on a day when the Soviet Union decided to launch an attack under precisely calibrated, ideal conditions that suited the American defense software. Any deviation, a different launch azimuth, a warhead equipped with a simple radar spoofing balloon, an attack during a period of high solar activity would render the multi-billion-dollar shield as useless as a storm drain in a drought. The Soviets wouldn't need to outbuild the defense, they simply needed to vary their attack, something any competent weapons officer would do as a matter of course. The Bell Labs report, when it was quietly circulated to the highest levels of the Pentagon and the White House's science advisors, landed with the force of a physical blow. It didn't just criticize a weapons system, it eviscerated the strategic premise behind it. The dream of a perfect, leak-proof nuclear shield was revealed to be just that, a dream built on flawed assumptions and over-optimized code. The political fallout was immediate and severe. Congressional committees that had been lavish with funding now demanded answers. Rival services, particularly the Air Force, which had its own competing and equally problematic Bomark missile program, seized on the failure as proof of the Army's technological overreach. Within the Zeus program itself, a schism opened. The true believers, the engineers who had poured their lives into the project, argued that the algorithm could be fixed, made more robust, given a wider envelope of engagement parameters. It would take time and money, but it was possible. The pragmatists and the military end users, however, saw a deeper, incurable disease. If the core logic was this fragile, what other hidden frailties lurked in the system? How could you ever trust it with the fate of cities? The weapon's very reason for being, to provide a guaranteed, reliable defense, had been invalidated. A shield that only worked sometimes was worse than no shield at all. It fostered a false sense of security that could lead to catastrophe. The Nike Zeus program did not die immediately. It lingered for years, a zombie project kept alive by a bureaucratic inertia, contractor lobbying, and the terrifying absence of any better idea. But its heart had been cut out on the day the Bell report was read. The failure of Test 505 was not a stumble on the path to success, it was a spotlight illuminating a dead end. The American pursuit of a perfect nuclear shield had run headlong into the immutable chaos of war, and the limitations of human foresight coded into a machine and launched into the sky, where it drifted, silent and blind, a monument to ambition's collision with reality. The lesson was written in the empty space between two green lines on a plot table, a 900-kilometer gap that no amount of money or wishful thinking could ever close. The Sheridan returned from Vietnam a scarred veteran, its aluminum hull pocked with the evidence of 1,000 close calls, the star-shaped craters of shrapnel,
the dark, scorched blooms of rocket-propelled grenade hits, and the shiny, wrench-like patches welded over machine gun penetrations. To the traditional armor branch, sipping coffee at Fort Knox and mourning the decline of the heavy steel cavalry, these vehicles were walking testaments to failure. They were proof of concept for a concept no self-respecting tanker wanted. The official reports cataloged the litany of sins: the chronic mechanical unreliability, the vulnerability, the ever-present danger of the combustible hydraulic fluid, and the volatile bagged charges for the main gun. The consensus among the brass seemed to be that the Sheridan had narrowly survived its own flawed existence in Vietnam through a mixture of dumb luck and the unique, low-intensity nature of that war. Its future appeared to be a short one, a swift retirement to the boneyard, a cautionary tale in procurement textbooks. But a curious thing happened. The Sheridan refused to die. It lingered on, not in the mainline armored divisions, but in the fringes, in the units that lived and breathed the impossible mission. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, America's Strategic Fire Brigade, looked at the Sheridan not with a tanker's disdain, but with a paratrooper's pragmatic calculus. They had nothing else. No other vehicle in the entire U.S. arsenal could do what the Sheridan could do: fold its antennas, be driven onto a waiting C-330 or C-141, flown across an ocean, and then, at the edge of a hostile drop zone, be shoved out of the back of a low-flying airplane with a cluster of parachutes. It was the only armored fist they could deliver from the sky. For the airborne, the Sheridan's flaws were not deal-breakers. They were the price of admission for having any armored direct-fire support in the critical first hours of an air assault. So while the regular Army began to mothball its Sheridans in the late 1970s, the airborne units held on to theirs, nursing the temperamental machines, learning every idiosyncrasy, and developing a culture of expertise around them. The crews of the 373rd Armor, Airborne, and later the 117th Cavalry in the 82nd became a priesthood of a peculiar faith. They knew which circuit breakers would pop if you traversed the turret too fast. They could diagnose a misfire by the sound of the breech mechanism cycling. They treated their vehicles not as trusted steeds, but as volatile, occasionally brilliant partners in a high-wire act. This second life of the Sheridan began not with a bang, but with a series of swift, sharp knocks on doors across the Caribbean in Central America. The world was changing, and America's military was being called upon not to fight massive armored battles on the plains of Germany, but to conduct rapid, precise interventions in complex, urban environments. And in this new world of small wars and forced entries, the Sheridan, improbably, found its purpose. The first call came in 1983. The island of Grenada, a tiny speck in the Antilles, was convulsing in a Marxist coup. American medical students were trapped. The Reagan administration ordered an invasion, Operation Urgent Fury. It was to be a classic airborne show of force, and the 82nd Airborne needed its guns. On October 25th, Sheridans from the 2nd Platoon, Company A 373rd Armor, were loaded onto C-130s. The crews, many of whom had never expected to see combat, sat in the red-lit bellies of the transports as they roared low over the Caribbean. Over the Point Saline's drop zone, the green light flashed. The planes shuddered as the Sheridan, fastened to a massive G-11E pallet, was extracted by a drogue chute and vanished into the swirling prop wash. From the ground, paratroopers watched as the angular shapes of the tanks, swaying beneath their canopies like strange, heavy fruit, descended through the smoke and into the chaos of the landing zone. On the ground, the Sheridans proved decisive. Their mobility let them claw their way up the rough hills from the airfield. At the Calypso richly named Frequente neighborhood, a platoon of Sheridans encountered a fortified Cuban position blocking the advance. The big 152mm guns spoke, first with high explosive rounds that shattered concrete walls, then with canister that cleared trenches with horrific efficiency. The psychological impact was immense. The opposing forces, expecting infantry and light weapons, were unprepared for the sudden appearance of armored vehicles. Tanks, by any measure, delivered from the sky. The Grenada intervention was a messy, flawed operation, plagued by inter-service rivalry and poor intelligence. But for the Sheridan crews, it was a validation. Their oddball vehicle had worked. It had deployed globally in hours and provided the crucial hammer blow where lighter weapons had stalled. 6 years later, in December 1989, the call came again. This time, the target was Panama. Operation Just Cause was a night assault, a surgical strike to depose Manuel Noriega. The 82nd Sheridans were once again on the leading edge. In the pitch-black early morning of December 20th, they rolled out of C-5 Galaxies and C-141 Starlifter transports onto the tarmac at Torrijos International Airport, their engines coughing to life in the humid dark. Their mission was to secure the airport and then push into Panama City to support Rangers seizing the Pacora River Bridge.
What followed was some of the most intense urban combat the vehicle would ever see. One Sheridan, call sign Viking 33, became emblematic of both the vehicle's fragility and its shocking resilience. Driving down a narrow street in the El Chorrillo neighborhood, it was ambushed. An RPG-7 rocket streaked out of an alley and struck the vehicle square on the front hull. The shape-charged jet pierced the aluminum armor, ignited the hydraulic fluid, and turned the crew compartment into an inferno. The driver was killed instantly. The rest of the crew, horrifically burned, managed to escape. The aluminum hull, as it had in Vietnam, burned with a fierce, chemical intensity. It was a tragedy that echoed the worst fears of the tank's critics. Yet, in that same night, across the city, other Sheridans were proving indispensable. At the Comandancia, Noriega's headquarters, Sheridans used their Beehive and HE rounds to systematically reduce fortified strongpoints, their fire precisely directed by special forces teams on the ground. Their small size allowed them to navigate streets that would have choked an M1 Abrams. Their firepower was disproportionate to their footprint. They were the perfect tool for a messy, point-blank fight in a city where the enemy was not a line of Soviet T-72s, but squads of dug-in Digbat paramilitaries. By dawn, the Sheridan had written another contradictory chapter in its story, a vehicle that could be killed by a single infantryman with a rocket, but whose presence on the battlefield could dictate the outcome of a national-scale intervention. The ultimate and most ironic test was still to come. By 1990, the Sheridan was ancient. Its technology was from the analog age. Its last factory had closed years before. As the U.S. military mobilized for Operation Desert Shield in response to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, the Sheridans seemed finally headed for the scrap heap. The airborne would ride into battle in Humvees. The new M1 Abrams and M2 Bradley, titans of steel and composite armor, were the future. But the 82nd Airborne was going, and they insisted on taking their guns. A desperate depot-level effort was launched to refurbish and upgrade a battalion's worth of Sheridans. They were given new AN-VVS-2 night vision sights, bolted-on reactive armor tiles, slabs of explosive meant to disrupt shape-charge jets, and additional external armor on the whole front. They were, in essence, given a final layer of bandages and sent to war one last time. When the ground war of Operation Desert Storm began on February 24, 1991, the 3rd 73rd Armored Sheridans were attached to the French 6th Light Armored Division, the Daguet Division, on the far western flank of the coalition advance. Their mission was to race north and then east, cutting off the Iraqi retreat along Highway 8. It was a classic cavalry screening mission, but in a desert environment the Sheridan was never designed for. Critics predicted disaster. The fine, talcum-like sand would clog its delicate air filters and shred its transmission. Its light armor would be vulnerable to even the oldest Iraqi tank guns. What happened was a final, glorious anomaly. The Sheridans, keeping pace with the fast-moving French AMX-10 RCs and VAB armored cars, performed flawlessly. The dry desert air, for once, didn't cause electrical shorts. The wide tracks gave it superb mobility in the soft sand. And in the few direct fire engagements they had, the Sheridan's fire control system, primitive as it was more than a match for the Iraqi defenders. The Shalalia missile system, the white elephant of Vietnam, finally found a use. At ranges beyond 2,000 meters, Sheridan crews used the wire-guided missiles to engage and destroy Iraqi bunkers and armored personnel carriers with precise, first-round hits. The missile's shape-charged warhead, designed to crack the frontal armor of a T-62, made a mockery of the thin-skinned Iraqi vehicles. The Sheridan was fighting the war it was originally built for, a fast, mobile flanking action against Soviet-style forces, a quarter-century late and halfway across the world from where anyone had imagined. The war ended in 100 hours. Not a single Sheridan was lost to enemy fire.
The vehicle that had been labeled a death trap had survived the most lopsided armored conflict in history without a scratch. It was a final, baffling twist in its story. It had succeeded by becoming something its original designers never intended, a reliable, if eccentric, component of a supremely competent and dominant combined arms team. Even then, it wasn't done. The Sheridan served on, a ghost from another age. It provided fire support for peacekeepers in the Sinai. It sat on the demilitarized zone in Korea. And when the U.S. invaded Iraq again in 2003, a handful of Sheridans from the 82nd Airborne's Cavalry Squadron were once again loaded onto transport planes. They rolled into Iraq during the initial air assault, the last of their kind going to war alongside the Abrams and Bradleys of the digital age. They were finally, formally retired in 2005. Their unique capability made obsolete not by failure, but by the advent of the precision-guided parachute-droppable munitions and the overwhelming reach of air power. The need to drop a tank from a plane had at last faded. So, how does one judge the M551 Sheridan? The ledger is starkly divided. On one side, a violent recoil that crippled its own optics, aluminum armor that could be pierced by heavy machine guns, a missile system that was rarely used and often broken, a propensity to burn with its crew trapped inside, a maintenance nightmare that required constant, loving care. On the other, the only armored direct-fire support weapon that could be delivered anywhere in the world within 18 hours, a 152mm gun that could level a building, clear a jungle trail, or snipe a bunker from 2 kilometers away, a mobility that allowed it to go where heavier tanks could not, a firepower that was disproportionate to their footprint. They were the perfect tool for a messy, point-blank fight in a city where the enemy was not a line of Soviet T-72s, but squads of dug-in Digbat paramilitaries. The Sheridan was never perfect. It was a compromise, a bundle of dangerous trade-offs held together by wire, welding, and the sheer courage of its crews. It was a tank that should have been a failure, and by many rigorous technical definitions, it was. But it was also always there. It was there in the steaming hell of the Ashu Valley. It was there in the pre-dawn dark over Grenada. It was there in the narrow streets of Panama City, burning and fighting in the same hour. It was there in the vast, empty desert of Iraq, outrunning its own grim reputation. It was there whenever the phone rang for the airborne, and the mission was impossible, and the only thing that could possibly do the job was the thing nobody else wanted. It was, in the end, a machine defined not by its specifications, but by its service. A band tank, saved by war, sustained by necessity, and carried into legend on the backs of the paratroopers who, despite everything, learned to trust it. Its story is not one of engineering triumph, but of martial stubbornness, a testament to the idea that in the confusion of war, the right tool for the job is often the one you have, no matter how flawed, as long as you have the will to use it.